Recently, the NFL Throwback channel, which is a great channel, did a video about every NFL team's Mount Rushmore. Now, that's basically another way of saying every NFL team's best 4 players ever. I decided that instead of doing my own Mount Rushmore, that I am going to react to their decisions and correct them if I think they got any of the choices wrong. Remember, this is my opinion, so don't get too upset. Without further ado, let's begin. The Arizona Cardinals, we got, of course, Larry Fitzgerald, Aeneas Williams, Larry Wilson. He was multiple-time All-Pro back in the day. And Dan Dierdorf, you might know him better as an announcer. I had no problem with 3 of the 4, but the one that I would swap out would be Dan Dierdorf in place of Patrick Peterson. Now, I think that Patrick Peterson might be a little bit overrated, but he was one of the best players in the league for the Cardinals for a decade, multiple-time All-Pros, and he's going to be a Hall of Famer someday, just like Dierdorf is, so I was just switching those 2 out. Next up, we got the Atlanta Falcons. Now, this is probably going to be the most controversial one for me. I'm going to swap out, well, first off, Matt Ryan and Julio Jones are obviously locks, but the 2 that I had a problem with are Michael Vick and Deion Sanders, because those are 2 influence type picks. Off the field, their influence, obviously, they belong here, but I'm talking strictly on the field. Michael Vick, he made 1 conference championship game. He wasn't that good of a quarterback for the Falcons, and he played just really 4 or 5 years there. And same with Deion Sanders. Deion Sanders was there for 5 years, and the defenses were constantly terrible even with him. Now, that's not his fault, but he was only there for 5 years. So if you're talking about the best players for the franchise in a Falcons uniform, I would swap out Vic and Deion Sanders for Jesse Tuggle, who was a multiple-time Pro Bowl, the all-time leading tackler, played in a Super Bowl with the Falcons, and also Roddy White, who was the best receiver Falcons had before Julio Jones came around, and also has over 10,000 yards receiving for the franchise. They both did more in Falcons uniforms than Vic and Deion did, so I would swap out those 2. For the Baltimore Ravens, now this is where sometimes the NFL channel, NFL Throwback, got it right. And for the Ravens, it's Ray Lewis, Ed Reed, Lamar Jackson, and Jonathan Ogden. Now, Lewis and Reed and Ogden, they're all first ballot Hall of Famers, some of the best players to ever play. And Lamar Jackson, whatever the discussion is about him, he's a 2-time MVP. So even though Joe Flacco has that great 2012 playoff run with the Super Bowl and the Super Bowl MVP, Lamar is the better quarterback than Flacco was, even though in the postseason he hasn't really lived up to his talent yet. Still, when you have a quarterback with 2 MVPs, it's hard to leave them off the list. So I fully agree with what the NFL Throwback channel did. I also fully agreed with their Mount Rushmore for the Bills, although honestly, I think we're getting to a point where you can start to argue whether or not Josh Allen is better than Jim Kelly. Thurman Thomas, Hall of Famer, MVP. Bruce Smith is one of the top 5 defensive players ever. Obviously, everyone's going to laugh at O.J. Simpson because of his off-field shit, but he was the best running back in the 1970s, so he obviously belongs there. I did kind of hesitated. I said, should I replace Kelly with Josh Allen? I think in a vacuum, Josh Allen's probably better than Jim Kelly. But at this point in time, Jim Kelly, it's hard to knock 4, even though they lost all of them, to make 4 straight Super Bowls as starting quarterback, even though Frank Reich helped out a little bit. That's a hell of an accomplishment. So I give Kelly the nod still over Josh Allen, but a couple more years of Josh Allen being Josh Allen, I think Jim Kelly's going to have to move over. Moving on to the Panthers, once again, and I swear to God, the rest of this video is not just going to be me agreeing with all of them. Panthers, it was another pretty easy top 4. Cam Newton, although I thought he was overrated, he was an MVP, took him to the Super Bowl, has all the franchise records. Julius Peppers is a no-brainer. Steve Smith's a no-brainer. He belongs in the Hall of Fame. Luke Kuechly is also going to be in the Hall of Fame someday, even though his career was short. Pretty easy that those are the top 4 there. Not a lot of discussion to be had. Move on to the Bears. Now, this one, again, I agreed with the channel on all 4 of them, but I almost subbed out Sid Luckman just because, the whole plumber situation. He was playing against plumbers and off-duty firefighters. But it just was too hard to ignore his accomplishments for his era and the fact that he's by far the best quarterback the Bears have ever had. When you're by far the best player teams ever had at the most important position, I feel like you belong on the Mount Rushmore. Obviously, Walter Payton's easy. It was hard for me. I was thinking, should I sub out Singletary or Dick Butkus with Brian Urlacher? And I decided to leave Singletary and Butkus on there. But Urlacher would have been my 5th choice. He just missed the cut. Finally, we get to the Cincinnati Bengals, and I did disagree with one of the 4 choices. Ken Anderson, I was thinking, should I go maybe Boomer Esiason? Again, both Anderson and Esiason, they were MVP quarterbacks. They both appeared in the Super Bowl. They both lost to the 49ers. Anderson, though, had more longevity with the Bengals and still has all the franchise records, although Joe Burrow is probably going to break all of them and will probably be on the Mount Rushmore by the time he's over. Anthony Munoz is considered by many to be the best offensive lineman ever, so he's obviously here. Ken Riley, underrated player, had over 60 interceptions with the Bengals back in the day. My change to this Mount Rushmore, they had Chad Johnson on there, and Chad Johnson obviously was a great receiver for many years there, but I felt like Geno Atkins should take his place. If this is a positionless Mount Rushmore, I think Geno Atkins was really, he wasn't as good as Aaron Donald, but he was kind of like an Aaron Donald in the mold of poor man's Aaron Donald, and he made several first-team All-Pros and was like an 8-time Pro Bowler. I think he belongs there over Chad Johnson. We get to the Cleveland Browns, and again, Jim Brown obviously is easy. Joe Thomas, first ballot Hall of Famer, one of the best offensive linemen ever, easy choice. Otto Graham, very similar to Sid Luckman, played in a different era, was kind of like the Tom Brady of his era, where he won the most championships, even though he had some bad playoff games, but he's still the best quarterback the Browns have ever had in terms of accomplishments, so he makes it. They put Lou Groza on here. Now, no disrespect to Lou Groza, but I said, you know what, Myles Garrett, with my own eyes, Myles Garrett, I think he belongs on the Mount Rushmore already. Some people might say it's too soon. I don't think it is. I think he's one of the best defensive players I've ever seen, and he's just entering his prime, so I think that it's not even going to be a discussion by the time he's at the end of his career comes around. But I think Myles Garrett's already on the Mount Rushmore for Browns players, and that's the one choice that I would make differently than the Throwback Channel. Moving on to Dallas. Now, Dallas had a shitload of great players, obviously, throughout their history, which pains me to say as an Eagles fan, but you can't deny their history. Honestly, this is more of a personal preference. Roger Staubach was statistically the best quarterback of the 70s. Pro Bowler, won a couple Super Bowls, Super Bowl MVP. Even though Troy Aikman has more Super Bowls as a Dallas quarterback, and Tony Romo has the all-time stats, Staubach has the best combination of all that, so I can see him being on there. Emmitt Smith's the all-time leading rusher. That's a pretty easy choice. Randy White was, 6 or 7-time first-team All-Pro, one of the best, defensive linebacker hybrids ever, so I can understand that selection. Bob Lilly was the one where I didn't feel great about making a change here, but I just said, you know what, fuck it. From what I've seen, I would put DeMarcus Ware in place of Bob Lilly. Now, DeMarcus Ware, his teams didn't have the success that Bob Lilly's teams had with the Cowboys, but I felt like DeMarcus Ware was one of, if not the best defensive player in the league for close to half a decade, and it was reflected in his numbers, and I believe he belongs on the Dallas Cowboys Mount Rushmore, even though he didn't necessarily win any championships with them, but he's in the Hall of Fame, rightfully so. He's one of the best players I ever saw, so that's no disrespect to Bob Lilly, but you got to move over, pal. Moving on to Denver. Now, this was another tough one. John Elway obviously is the easy one. Even if you think he's overrated with his stats, whatever, he's definitely on the Broncos Mount Rushmore. Von Miller, Super Bowl MVP, going to be a Hall of Famer, multiple-time All-Pro with the Broncos. He belongs there. I have no problem with that. Shannon Sharp was kind of like, I don't know. He's Hall of Fame tight end, but at the end of the day, I could see why he was there. Terrell Davis was a tough cut for me, but, because he was, statistically, he's like the best postseason running back ever on a per-game basis. He won an MVP at a 2,000-yard season, won 2 Super Bowls. But for me, I do kind of give him a little bit of a side eye because how much of him was a result of the zone blocking scheme that a bunch of other running backs after him also had great success with in Denver, with Mike Shanahan and that zone blocking scheme. So I kind of look at him as a little bit of a system running back, and he only really played 4 healthy seasons. So I'm going to say I would swap him out with Peyton Manning. And even though Peyton Manning really had, he only played 4 years in Denver, made it to Super Bowl twice, obviously won the Super Bowl, even though that was more of the defense. But I mean, when he had arguably the greatest season ever, regular season ever by a quarterback, 2013, broke the single season touchdown mark again, single season passing yards mark. He made Denver relevant again, made them a winner. So I think he belongs on the Mount Rushmore, even though most people might say he didn't play long enough with the Broncos. I say fuck you. The Detroit Lions, we got the easy 2, which is Barry Sanders and Calvin Johnson. Joe Schmidt was a guy who was one of the best players of his era. Look him up. He had a shitload of All-Pro selections, so I just was like, hey, I can understand it, even though he's a little bit old time. But Bobby Lane, I'm like, Bobby Lane, yeah, he won championships. He won a championship or 2, but his numbers weren't that great. So I decided to just replace him with Matthew Stafford. And I know Matthew Stafford never won a playoff game with the Lions, but he is statistically easily the best quarterback the Lions have ever had. He was there for, I think, 12 years. So I think he deserves to be on that Mount Rushmore just because his statistics are so much better than any other quarterback that's ever been there. Moving on to Green Bay, and Favre was an easy selection. He's such a classy guy too, my goodness. Aaron Rodgers, another easy selection, even though he's a little bit of a weirdo. Don Hudson was, again, one of those guys guys, kind of like a Wilt Chamberlain, where the stats for his era were so ridiculous that he has to be here, even though his competition was probably dog shit. The one that I struggled with was Bart Starr, but at the end of the day, I was like, this guy, he was a quarterback for 5 championship teams. He won an MVP. His playoff numbers, even though he didn't have a lot of value necessarily, his playoff numbers are still some of the best efficiency-wise. So he was a clutch performer, and at the end of the day, I'm like, isn't that what you want? So you had Reggie White was another selection. They have a bunch of guys, Jim Taylor from back in the day, from those great Packers teams with Lombardi. So I let Bart Starr stay there, but that was the toughest one to keep. Moving on to the Texans, J.J. Watt, no-brainer. Andre Johnson, no-brainer. DeAndre Hopkins, hotel room respecter. I could see him being on there, so I didn't have a problem with that. The one, I guess, issue I had was Dwayne Brown. Yeah, he had a couple good years, was first team All-Pro in 2012, but I think Arian Foster was a better player, and Arian Foster was also a first team All-Pro. Was the best running back the Texans have ever had. The elephant in the room here is Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson was the best quarterback the Texans ever had, but obviously we all know about his off-field stuff. I almost went with Matt Schaub here too, but Arian Foster, I think, gets that last. He deserves that last selection instead of Dwayne Brown. We go to the Colts, and they have a very, very rich history. Peyton Manning's easy. Johnny Unitas, easy. Marvin Harrison, even though he was a terrible postseason receiver, he's one of the 4 or 5 best receivers ever. 128 touchdown catches. He's an easy choice. They had Gino Marchetti here, and again, this might be controversial. I know because he had a bunch of All-Pros and stuff, but I went with Reggie Wayne in his place instead. Reggie Wayne, his numbers, people might be surprised by Reggie Wayne's numbers. He had over 14,000 receiving yards, over 1,000 catches, all with the Colts. He got kind of outshined a bit by Marvin Harrison for most of his career, but Reggie Wayne is a legitimate Hall of Famer as well, and I went with him as the final spot. Keeping it in the AFC South, we go to Jacksonville. Fred Taylor, I understand it. Tony Baselli is a Hall of Famer, and even though he didn't have a very long career, but he was great, so I can understand that. Jimmy Smith is the best receiver, has all the team records for that. They chose Mark Brunell. I decided to go a different direction. Mark Brunell, you could say, is probably the best quarterback the Jaguars have ever had, but the bar is not really high there. So I decided to go with Maurice Jones-Drew, who was one of the best running backs in the league for a good 2 or 3 years. And also, he had about like 80 touchdowns with the Jaguars. He scored a bunch of touchdowns. Was a first-team All-Pro in 2011. So I think Maurice Jones-Drew gets that final spot on the Mount Rushmore instead of Mark Brunell, although Mark Brunell did take the Jaguars as a quarterback to 2 conference championship games. So I can see why Mark Brunell could get that last spot. But I think in a vacuum, Maurice Jones-Drew was a better player. Go to the Chiefs, and not a lot of discussion here. Mahomes is easy. Travis Kelce is in discussion for the best tight end of all time, as is Tony Gonzalez. So you got those 3. The 4th spot, Derek Thomas. You could maybe swap him out with Will Shields, but Derek Thomas, Hall of Famer. He died young, but he had over 100 sacks. He's one of the best pass rushers of all time. So I can understand why they put him there too. So no, not a lot of discussion here with Chiefs Mount Rushmore. Moving on to the Raiders, another team that, despite not being that great in recent history, back in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, early 80s, they were all incredible. So they have a lot of history here. Tim Brown was an easy choice. Marcus Allen, I kind of struggled a little bit keeping him there because he really only had 2 or 3 great years with the Raiders, but he did win a Super Bowl MVP, so I kept him on there. Gene Upshaw was one of the best offensive linemen of his era, but I'm surprised, NFL throwback, and they put Ken Stabler in there, and Ken Stabler had some good years for the Raiders, but he wasn't a dominant quarterback. I was surprised that NFL throwback left Jim Otto off the list. Jim Otto was a double-digit time first-team All-Pro guy, which is ultra rare. So he was in discussion for the best center of all time. Now, I know nobody gives a shit about centers in football, but this dude, his accolades, he has the most accolades of any Raiders player ever, but they had a bunch of other great players, Howie Long, Cliff Branch, you could think about, but I went with Jim Otto because he was the most decorated player, and I'm surprised he wasn't on there. We go to the Chargers. Obviously, LT's there. Junior Seau's there. Dan Fouts, it was kind of like Dan Fouts and Phillip Rivers. Ironic they played for the same franchise because they're kind of the same quarterback, a bunch of big stats, but no wins, no Super Bowl appearances. Their playoff history left a lot to be desired. But I think Dan Fouts was maybe just a slightly better, and he played in a tougher era for quarterbacks, even though he also played in a system, the Air Coryell, that was a little bit ahead of its time. So he might have been maybe a bit of a system quarterback, but I would still take him over Phillip Rivers. Phillip Rivers is just one of the guys that no matter how good his stats stats where he just is one of the worst clutch quarterbacks I've ever seen. So I give the nod to Fouts there. The one, and again, I'm surprised that they just left him off. I don't understand. I would take Antonio Gates over Lance Allworth. Antonio Gates has over 100 touchdown catch, all one of the best tight ends of all time. He should be in the Hall of Fame. I don't know why he's not in the Hall of Fame yet. He belongs on the Los Angeles Chargers Mount Rushmore, and I really don't have any second thoughts about that at all. Moving on to the LA Rams, Aaron Donald's an easy choice. Merlin Olsen, Deacon Jones. Deacon Jones, one of the best defensive players ever. Merlin Olsen was heavily decorated. Might have been slightly overrated, but still heavily decorated. His resume was hard to argue against, so I left him on there. They also had Jack Youngblood as a Hall of Famer, and also had a very good resume, but I said, there's got to be some offense in here, especially for a team that had the greatest show on turf, and I felt like the best player, regardless of position, on the greatest show on turf was Marshall Faulk. I think Marshall Faulk belongs on the Rams Mount Rushmore. Either him, or I wouldn't have a problem with, you got Isaac Bruce, Torrey Holt, Kurt Warner, any one of those guys. Orlando Pace is another one. I mean, there's a lot of choices to be made there, but I went with Marshall Faulk as the fourth one instead of Jack Youngblood. We go to the Dolphins, and this is one I felt like that they went a little bit too nostalgic here, at least in terms of thinking about the Dolphins when they were winning championships. Dan Marino is the easiest choice. Jason Taylor, easy choice. They said Larry Little, who was a guard, and obviously we all know Larry Zonka, super hardworking running back, just like John Riggins and Christian McCaffrey. But I would sub out Zonka with Dwight Stevenson, who didn't play as long as other players, but on a per snap basis was, for film watchers, is basically the best center that's ever played. And I would sub Dwight Stevenson in for Larry Zonka, and I would sub in Zach Thomas, who some people say was a little bit of a stat merchant and wasn't as great as his stats, but still his stats were so good, and he was a multiple-time All-Pro guy. I would sub in Zach Thomas for Larry Little, even though Larry Little had rings and Zach Thomas didn't. I mean, hey, they put Dan Marino here instead of Bob Greasy, so it's the best players, not the players with the most rings. Minnesota Vikings. I was actually surprised at how many great players the Vikings have had and how tough this was. Alan Page won MVP, is one of the best defensive linemen ever, so I could see that. Chris Carter is the all-time leading receiver in the history of the franchise, one of the best receivers ever. I could also see that. Then it gets a little bit messy if you really look at all the great players they had. Adrian Peterson won an MVP and is going to be in the Hall of Fame. Really the last truly great running back besides maybe Derrick Henry. Every down back. I mean, I said he was okay to stay on here. Fran Tarkenton, I said, you know what? I'm sorry, Fran. And Fran Tarkenton's probably the best quarterback the Vikings have ever had. Took him to a couple Super Bowls. But I said Randy Moss, for the 5 or 6 years that he was with the Vikings, that's one of the best 5 or 6 year stretches any receiver's ever had. And he belongs. I felt like Randy Moss belonged there. Can't forget about like John Randall McDaniel. I mean, the Vikings have had a lot of great players. Carl Eller, there's a lot of great players they've had over the years, but you only get 4. And so I thought Fran Tarkenton should have been subbed out for Randy Moss. Some people might disagree with that, but again, I don't care. It's my list. We go with the Patriots now. 3 of these are pretty easy, and yes, that includes Tom Brady, who, as you all know, I'm not a big fan of, to put it lightly, but he's there. Gronk is the best tight end I've ever seen, so he's there. John Hanna, considered by many to be the best guard in the history of the NFL. He's there. The last one I thought was kind of surprising. I'm surprised they went with Ty Law. Ty Law was a great player in the Hall of Fame, but I felt like Andre Tippett, who people forget about because he wasn't a part of the Dynasty era Patriots, I felt like he had a better resume than Ty Law and deserved to be the 4th spot. And honestly, you could argue that Ty Law wasn't even the best defensive player on those teams. You could say Richard Seymour was better. Even in the secondary, a guy like Rodney Harrison was a huge impact, was a great impactful player as well. So I'm surprised I went with Ty Law, but I would place Ty Law with Andre Tippett, although Ty Law is obviously one of the best Patriots ever. Moving on to the Saints, this is one of the teams I didn't have a problem with any of the selections. Ricky Jackson, part of the Dome Patrol. Drew Brees is the easiest choice ever. Willie Roaf, again, was part of those good Dome Patrol early 90s teams, although he was a Hall of Fame offensive lineman. He later went on to be with the Chiefs too. Cameron Jordan, at first I kind of said, really? And then I looked at his numbers and his consistency, and he's been there now for 13 years, and he's putting together a Hall of Fame resume, so I said, you know what, I have no problem with that. So I got all 4 of those guys there. Moving on to the Giants, this one, again, for a team that's considered such a blue blood franchise, they really don't have that many long periods of success. Lawrence Taylor, obviously, he's great with kids. He loves kids. He's an easy selection. So is Michael Strahan. Emlyn Tunnell was a guy that most of you probably never heard of, and I admit that I'd heard of him before, but I never really took time to look at his numbers. He had like over 70 interceptions. So I'm like, okay, yeah, he belongs there. They went with a guy named Mel Hine, and I just said, you know what? For as average as Eli Manning might have been, the guy still won 2 Super Bowls and 2 Super Bowl MVPs. So I couldn't leave a multiple-time Super Bowl MVP winner off this list for the Giants. I just couldn't. So no disrespect to Mel Hine. I'm sure that his family is somewhere, and they're probably pissing and shitting themselves in anger, but that's too bad. Going on to to the New York Jets. Pretty self-explanatory here. Joe Namath is one that some might find controversial because they say he's the worst quarterback in the Hall of Fame because of his stats. But this, again, we're talking about just for the Jets. He won their only Super Bowl for him, was Super Bowl MVP. Did actually have some good years, So I don't have a problem with Namath being there. Curtis Martin was a great running back for many years, although I think he's the one. Darrelle Revis was also a guy. I agree with his selection. Don Maynard is the best receiver in the history of the franchise. Curtis Martin, it was like, okay, he was good, but you could say maybe Mark Gastineau. There's other guys in there that you could have possibly chosen besides Curtis Martin, but he got the nod. Moving on to my team, the Eagles, Weapon X, Brian Dawkins. I didn't have a problem with that. He's one of the best safeties ever. And then obviously Reggie White was an easy choice. Chuck Bednarik was two-way player. He had like 5 or 6 first-team All-Pro selections, so I had no problem with that. The one I did have a problem with was Steve Van Buren. Very good player for his era, but I felt like Jason Kelce should have been the final face on the Eagles Mount Rushmore. He made, 6 first-team All-Pros. He's going to be in the Hall of Fame someday. Obviously, you got a bunch of people that was tough to leave off. Donovan McNabb, Randall Cunningham, Harold Carmichael, all these great players that the Eagles have had throughout the years. But I would say that's a pretty good Mount Rushmore. My Mount Rushmore. Pittsburgh Steelers, this was another tough one. Mean Joe Green, he was kind of the first piece of the Steel Curtain puzzle. Jack Lambert is also there. Ben Roethlisberger, classiest respecter of women, absolutely incredible at protecting women from strangers while standing outside of a bathroom stall. He was quarterback there, has all those franchise records, is going to be in the Hall of Fame, won a couple Super Bowls, so I get that. Some people might take issue with Terry Bradshaw, but Terry Bradshaw, I look at this, I'm like, Terry Bradshaw's career stats aren't very good. People say he was just a product of the Steel Curtain, and I thought that way for many years, but I looked at it, I'm like, Bradshaw, his first couple seasons were really, really not good, but the last 7-8 years of his career, he won an MVP, he made 3 Pro Bowls, he did win 4 Super Bowls, his Super Bowl stats are incredible, his fourth quarter Super Bowl stats are ridiculous, especially for the era he played in. He won 2 Super Bowl MVPs, so I feel like he belongs on there. Although I do feel like T.J. Watt, for example, is on his way to potentially knocking off either Joe Green or Jack Lambert. He isn't there yet, but he's getting close. No offense to Ray Allen. 49ers, this is probably the strongest Mount Rushmore. You have the best receiver of all time. You have arguably the best quarterback of all time. Another first ballot Hall of Fame quarterback, just for shits and giggles, and the best safety of all time in Ronnie Lott. And really not a lot of room for argument here, although I said, well, maybe Patrick Willis, but Patrick Willis didn't play long enough, so it's pretty cut and dry here. Don't have to spend a lot of time on this. The Seahawks, again, another pretty cut and dry list. Walter Jones, one of the best offensive linemen ever, Hall of Famer, easy choice. Bobby Wagner is going to be a Hall of Famer, although some might say that his numbers are a little bit inflated, but I mean, he's certainly without question one of the best members and is one of the best Seahawks players ever and will be in the Hall of Fame. Steve Largent, one of the best receivers of all time, and Russell Wilson, although he has kind of fallen off a lot quicker than a lot of people anticipated, he won a Super Bowl with the Seahawks, has some of the best numbers ever, any quarterback ever with Seattle. I just wish he didn't throw that fucking pass to Malcolm Butler at the end of Super Bowl 49, but I don't disagree with him being on the list. Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they went all defense, and Derek Brooks, Warren Sapp, those are the easy choices. They went with Leroy Selman because he was the original elite defensive player for the Buccaneers. I said, you know what, I'm going to swap him out for Rondé Barber, who should be in the Hall of Fame, who was one of the best defensive players, one of the best safeties for many, many years, won a Super Bowl. And I also swapped out John Lynch with Mike Evans, who is probably, again, going to be in the Hall of Fame, and he's had 1,000 yards receiving every year of his career, and he's obviously one of the best players the Buccaneers have ever had. He also gives some offense, so I think he belongs on the Mount Rushmore. Did I think about putting Brady here? For maybe a split second I did, but I said, you know what, fuck Tom Brady, he's got enough accolades, he can sit on the sidelines for this one. Moving on to Tennessee Titans, who also the former Houston Oilers, a lot of Houston Oilers on here. Earl Campbell, I understand he was an MVP, one of the best running backs ever. Bruce Matthews, one of the best offensive linemen ever, I get it. Warren Moon, Hall of Famer, I understand it, even though the Oilers maybe underachieved in the postseason with Warren Moon in that era, I understand it. Steve McNair, I kind of thought about, I was like, maybe should Derrick Henry be in that spot instead, but McNair took the Titans to the Super Bowl, won an MVP, co-MVP, even though he really shouldn't have. That should have been Peyton Manning Manning's full MVP. But, I'll let McNair get it, the final spot. Finally, we get to Washington. Darrell Green was an easy choice. Art Monk was a guy who I wasn't completely sure about, and then you look up his numbers, and he had over 1,000 catches and a shitload of yards, and you're like, okay, I get it. Won multiple Super Bowls. Sammy Baugh was a guy who was one of the original great players, one of the original superstars of the NFL. So I had to keep him on there because he had, had very good numbers for his era as a quarterback. He was also had like over 30 career interceptions. So the competition back then obviously might not have been as great, but I still think he belongs on here. They put John Riggins on here, and I decided, there has to be some quarterback appearance here. So I said either Sonny Jurgensen or Joe Theismann, and I said Joe Theismann deserves that last spot because he won a Super Bowl, he won an MVP, he took the Redskins. Oops, I said that, just bleep that out. He took Washington to back-to-back Super Bowls, and he's kind of one of the first people, even now, when you think about Washington, people know who Joe Theismann is. So I feel like he gets that fourth and final spot, and that about does it for all of my NFL Mount Rushmore selections. I hope that you didn't poop your diapers too badly.